girlfriend of a Boston police officer whose body was found
in the murder trial of Karen Reed after the jury said it was unable to
they
reach
will
a
retry
verdict.
Karen Reed
is
after a judge declared a
Hi, alternates. I have a question for you. How are you feeling? Are you feeling burnout yet, or are you still exhilarated to get on with the show? Do you feel yourself leaning one way or another, or are you torn about the charges? Because remember, a mixed verdict is okay. Well, listen, I will tell you, it's week 5, and every day I wonder, who will they call next? The Commonwealth says that they are almost done, and the defense anticipates a week and a half for their case. And I can almost guarantee that there will definitely be rebuttal evidence in this case. So if I were a betting woman, I would say that deliberations will likely start the week of June 16th. I don't know. What's the over-under on this guesstimate? Do you agree? Do you not agree? Do you think something crazy will happen before then? All right, before I begin today, I was talking to Tab and she wanted me to play this video clip for you. It was actually presented during day 19 and it's another Karen Reed clip. Here it is.
At 12:41, I leave a voicemail to John where you can clearly, and this will probably be played on Monday, you can clearly hear me pull into John's garage. You can hear my car sensors beeping as I come close to the sides of the garage truck. And then you hear the car go off, and then you hear the slight ding, ding, ding as I open the door, shut the door. I had high heels on that night. You hear me walk in, go into the stairs up into the kitchen, shut the door, and you hear me walk in the kitchen. It's like a full minute long. That's at 12:41.
And finally, clip 24.
I do. I mean, I'll tell you, John and I argued the morning of the 28th. Friday morning. So we think he died right around 12:25, 12:30 on the early morning of January 29th.
Do with that what you will, but let's get on to day 20. Day 20 started a little confusing for me because I thought after listening to day 19 that we were going to pick up with a woman, but instead we picked up with Dr. Izak Wolf, a neurosurgeon. But listen, between you and I, doesn't this guy look like Christopher Walken? I swear it's his doppelganger. Originally, I thought it was Christopher Walker, but then someone corrected me. So anyway, I digress. So the reason we started with Dr. Wolf today is because he's a busy guy and he had 2 surgeries yesterday. He has patients on Thursday and Friday, and he has to fly all the way back to Miami from Boston. So we needed to get the show on the road. Dr. Wolf laid out his credentials. He went to Yale Medical School, graduated in 1981, and he's basically the man, okay? He was there to testify today about impacts and injuries to the head. Specifically, he was there to give his opinion about what caused the injury to John O'Keefe's head and why his eyes were black. I honestly was overjoyed to see him because that's one of the things that has had me perplexed this entire case. Why did John O'Keefe have 2 black eyes? I don't think that I could do Dr. Wolf's testimony any justice with my own words. So I am going to let you hear clips from his own testimony that will help explain what he believes happened to John that night. Additionally, I do want to point out that he did see pictures of John's skull and also not only pictures of the outside, but of the inside, and he read the medical examiner's report. Here is Dr. Wolf with his testimony.
Wolf, I'm going to ask you to take a look at this photograph. Have you seen this photograph before?
Yes.
I want you to explain to us what you're seeing here and take us through the process of your observations.
Well, what we're seeing is an approximate 1.5 inch laceration with bridging tissue and contusions and abrasions. To us, that's just a classic blunt trauma injury. There's nothing other than just vanilla about it. This is what happens when soft tissue hits a solid ground. The skin tears apart a bit, but not through and through. As you can see, there's the bridging. You can see all the bruising or contusions and just the tear, a little bit serrated along the edges.
Thank you. If you could take that down. Dr. Wolf, as a result of that wound, did you have a chance to further look at information provided to you about the actual inside the skull of Mr. John O'Keefe?
Yes, it was the pictures that I was reviewing showed a non-depressed skull fracture extending linearly through the clivus and into the frontal fossa of Mr. O'Keefe over the orbital roofs. He had fractures along the temporal fossa as well. So it was a classic linear basilar skull fracture.
Is basal skull fracture a
It's
characterization?
basically the base of your skull is what it encompasses. So the opening at the very bottom is what we call the foramen magnum. That connects your brainstem to your spinal cord. And then as your brainstem goes up, it goes into the different skull areas that, talk about what we call the cerebral cortexes, your occipital lobe, your temporal lobes over here, and then your frontal lobes.
So can you walk us through what happens when someone incurs this type of injury to the back of the head, how it happens, and what are the next steps for a person?
So what happens is, you fall backwards, and the linear acceleration starts to take you back down with gravity. The skull hits the ground. It gets, in layman's terms, smashed a little bit. And then the brain moves forward as a response to that. And it moves forward because you have cerebral spinal fluid and because you have the deceleration, acceleration again. As it does, your skull, if you were to look inside your skull, it's like mini mountains along your temporal bones and your frontal bones. So the brain is being thrust forward at a fairly good speed, and it's getting bruised. You can think of it as if you took a hammer to your thumb. It's really turning black and blue. Those are the contusions. And so the temporal poles and the frontal poles are getting contusions because of that. At the same time, you have a space called the subarachnoid space. And I'm sure they're going to hear about the subarachnoid hemorrhage. And that space is it's very clear, thin membrane that covers all of your brain and all of your spinal cord. And normally, you really don't see it unless you open up the brain and you're operating. But when you either have a traumatic event like this, where little vessels are pulling apart underneath that membrane, or, for example, the classic, when you have an aneurysm burst, the space that the aneurysm bleeds to is the subarachnoid space. The other thing that occurs in trauma like this is you can get a subdural. So the dura is the membrane that covers the whole brain and also right down your spinal canal. And it's a very thin membrane that looks like very thin leather. And in that space between the brain and the dura can be a lot of veins that go towards a central vein called the sagittal sinus. And if those tear, you have a venous hemorrhage from, which is not arterial, so it's not quick, but that can develop into a subdural as well. If you tear a portion of your brain as well, and you get a little arterial bleeds, that could create a much faster subdural hematoma. And so when you look at the pathology, the autopsy of his brain, you're looking at a subarachnoid hemorrhage, you're looking at a subdural hemorrhage, neither one of them which was huge or would have required surgery, as well as the contusions that I described in his frontal poles, in his temporal poles, and then the original bang, which was in the occipital area. These are all findings that you would see on a CT scan and an MRI scan, without requiring an autopsy if he had made it to the emergency room.
I want to take a step back at the beginning. You said that this laceration on the back of his head was caused by a fall. Could this be caused by a fall landing on hard ground?
Yes, I mean, like I said, it's a classic blunt trauma laceration.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether this injury, the laceration and the basal fracture, was caused by Mr. O'Keefe falling backwards on the ground?
My opinion is that that's what caused his whole injury.
The pattern of the laceration, do you have an opinion whether that is consistent with hitting the cold, hard ground? Do you have an opinion, doctor, about whether that laceration on the back of his head was caused by a particular movement?
Well, the only way he could get this kind of an injury was to fall backwards, hit the back of his head, and then the resulting, energy forces going into his brain and to his base of his skull.
Would that type of laceration require Mr. O'Keefe to have hit a line type or a ridge type object?
A rich type of object?
Yes.
No, I mean, like I said, the tearing of the skin in that fashion, you could look it up, would be just a classic blunt trauma injury.
So as we were discussing, Dr. Wolf, you said this is a classic fall backwards. Is there anything about the pattern of that laceration that would suggest that there was a ridge or a line type edge that caused that wound?
Not necessarily.
And have you seen, in your experience, similar types of lacerations and breaks caused by falling on hard ground?
Yes, you can see that both in the occipital region. You can see it if patients fall on the, forehead. The skin tears, they're still bridging, and then they get bruises.
Some of your work was in Minnesota.
Correct.
Was it a colder part of Minnesota?
Very cold part of Minnesota.
you-
It's Minneapolis.
I'm sorry. Did you often see these type of injuries there?
Yes, I mean, we took care of a trauma center, Hennepin County. Very frequently, patients that are drunk fall down on ice sidewalks and could develop, lacerations in their head, epidurals, which are blood clots above the dura because they fracture a bone in the temporal area and they can get a bleed from a fractured artery. And it happens when people are shoveling snow and have a heart attack and fall backwards. So there are various ways that people fall, resulting in head injuries and lacerations to their forehead or to different areas of their head.
Can somebody suffer this type of injury simply by falling backwards?
Absolutely.
You had taken us through the process of falling backwards and then talked about what happens to the brain. Can I ask you a couple detailed questions about that?
Sure.
When you explained that the brain upon impact then shifts forward and hits the front of the skull, is there a medical term for that process?
Well, the medical term is a coup-Contrecoup injury. So the coup is when you first hit. In this case, it was the back of the head, as summarized by the laceration in the back of the head, and the contusions that the pathologist and the ME found in the back of the brain. And then the brain shifts forward, and as it's traveling at a certain velocity, because it's thrust forward on the floor of the base of the skull, it's getting bumped, and it's getting, again, you can think of it as a hammer hitting a thumb. It's getting black and blue in the areas that are sharpest.
Are there symptoms that result of the process Coup-Contrecoup?
This is clinically, it varies. I mean, you can go from anywhere from a simple concussion, where you sort of are unaware of what happened, but you're still awake, you're confused, all the way to ultimately being in a coma.
Can this type of injury, the coup-counter-coup, and what you see in the review of your files, could this type of injury happen from an attack by a weapon, like a bat or a hammer?
Well, he did not have a depressed skull fracture. So any focal hit like that would more likely than not have caused a depressed skull fracture. Blunt trauma, the way he had, the assumption, would cause the coup-counter-coup without a depressed skull fracture.
When the coup-counter-coup process happens with the skull fracture, does anything happen to the front of the skull?
Well, you're asking me, does the rest, the forces, depending on how hard they are, can generate fracture lines all the way to the anterior fossa. So you can have fractures along the lateral temporal area. You can have fractures along the orbital roof. The orbital roof is very thin. And so those forces can go all the way to that area.
Did you see any sign of orbital fractures in Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes, he had both the ME and the pictures taken, and the neuropathologist mentioned fractures of the orbital roof.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty how those fractures occurred?
From the trauma.
Could you just explain a little bit how that would happen?
Well, as he fell backwards and he struck his head, it was clearly at a very high speed generated by the gravity. The bone, depending on the quality of his bone, the density, then generated forces. There's a certain amount of lateral give, and then you get a linear force going forward. It drives all the way up the clivus and forward into the anterior fossa where his orbital roofs lay. And this is why people like this get what they call raccoon's eyes.
Do you have an opinion whether the brain itself could have caused the orbital fractures?
No. The brain is a soft substance. You could literally put your finger through the brain. We often operate on people fully awake. The brain couldn't possibly cause a fracture. The fracture was caused by the forces generated through that clivus, that middle bone in the middle of his base of the skull.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether or not the brain in any way could have caused these orbital fractures?
The answer is absolutely not.
In your study of the records and photographs, and in your experience treating these types of injuries, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether or not a person would remain conscious or would be immediately unconscious after the impact of the ground?
Well, it's impossible to know whether he became immediately unconscious, but his injuries were very substantial, and it's more probable than not that at some point he quickly became unconscious and was unable to do functional activities.
What does functional activities mean?
The ability to, get himself up and about would be one of the functional activities. The ability to call for help would be a very significant cortical function. And that's why I was talking about, that there's a variation on the theme from a simple concussion to a severe concussion like this.
If a person does not have functional abilities because they are rendered unconscious, does their body, could it still move?
Yes, this is the interesting thing about our brain. So the cortex, which is the top portion of your brain, can get separated from your brainstem functionally. And what happens then is that your body is not acting autonomically, meaning vegetative. So why does that happen? We think it's because as we were cavemen, and if a caveman became unconscious, as an animal came up to eat it, the animal would touch it. Well, you have these automatic movements. One of them is called decorticating, which is where you draw your arms like this and you throw your feet out. And then a worse neurological situation is when you decerebrate. Now you push your arms out along with your legs. And that would scare off an animal. So we think that over time, genetically, this is what happened to our brains in order to create these. But those kind of movements are not thought processes. In other words, your brain is not telling you, oh, you have pain, go ahead and decorticate or decerebrate. It's an automatic movement in response to pain.
I want you to take us back now to after the fall. Would Mr. O'Keefe, in your study and opinion, have died immediately?
No.
Can you share? I'm sorry.
Yes, I'll tell it. There is very few things that you head injury where you would die, quote, immediately. So if I took a knife and stabbed you in the back of your neck right below your skull and I drove it through your brainstem, you would probably die immediately. If I shot you below your ear and went through and through below your ear and shot through your brainstem, you would die immediately. But traumatic head injuries, you would not die immediately. It's a process. And it's a process of a combination of things. Brain swelling, which takes a while to develop, decreased blood flow to your brain because you're getting swelling, and ultimately death of the brainstem that controls your heart and your breathing. And so this is why there is a whole big issue about brain death. You know, when is someone brain dead? Because it's not instant and it can take a long time to be conceived. In these injuries that are very severe that we took care of, there was a high mortality rate. In the linear skull fractures, it was about 67%. But it took time for them to die. It could take days to weeks to months. And also, these people got to shock trauma, so it was a while, whether it was hours, before they were even starting to be taken care of, and yet they weren't dead yet. That's why I don't think it was immediate.
Was there any other observations you made about Mr. O'Keefe or his body that support your opinion that he didn't die immediately?
Well, the medical examiner took pictures of his periorbital area and diagnosed Raccoon's eyes. So Raccoon's eyes occur because there's leakage through the orbital fractures into the periorbital space. Normally, it takes about 24 to 48 hours to develop. It has been noted as early as 1 to 3 hours, which would make it not immediate.
Could we please have Exhibit 14? Dr. Wolf, could you share with us what you see here in this picture?
So right here, you can see the black and blue that sort of configures, if he had his eyes open, like what we describe as Raccoon's eyes, right? And that's not caused by direct trauma to his eyelids. It's caused by what I described as the basilar skull fracture, which went to the anterior fossa, which is right over the orbit here, inside with leakage of blood products into that periorbital area.
You mentioned that starts or takes at least 1 to 3 hours to begin?
Minimally, yes.
Okay, so what did you think? Did you get all of that? I mean, I thought Dr. Wolf was pretty easy to understand, but I feel like I would not have been able to do it justice and it would be kind of hard to explain. So I hope that that was hopeful. What I got out of Dr. Wolf's testimony was that the injury to the back of John's head and his black eyes were the result of a fall backwards. That's it. He didn't get punched in the eyes. It was just from the hit on the back of the head. I also got that a traumatic head injury does not result in a quick death, but dying from a head injury, kind of takes a process. Also, I thought it was good for the Commonwealth to point out that John's head injury was not the result of being hit with a bat or being hit with a hammer or being hit with any other sharp object. It was a flat, hard object. And the cold outside temperature, according to Dr. Wolf, didn't help John's situation. There was one more expert opinion that Dr. Wolf gave, and here it is.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether Mr. O'Keefe died immediately or within 15 minutes?
No, I don't think he died immediately. Neither the hypothermia nor this kind of head injury would kill you immediately in any clinical experience I have.
I thought that Dr. Wolf explained himself really well, and I was very eager to hear the cross-examination because this cross-examination in this trial is just crazy. And here is the bit that I think will stand out to jurors. The cross, by the way, was conducted by Robert Alessi.
Dr. Wolf, have you seen this photo depiction before today?
I believe I have.
Is it correct that injury on the upper right eyelid is caused by the application of force directly to that area of the front of the head, again, namely the upper eyelid?
That's possible, yes.
Is it more than possible? Is it probable that injury was caused by the application of force directly to that area of the front of his head?
Well, an easy answer to that would be is that that's not part of the periorbital ecchymosis.
Thank you, sir. That was exactly going to be my next question. This injury is unrelated to any of what you've been describing, the fall backwards, the force transfer inside the skull, the, as you described it, the dura, the cerebral spinal fluid, all of that dynamic that you so ably described on your direct examination. This injury has nothing to do with that, correct?
Correct.
There you have it. It appears that John did have an injury to his face or above or near his eye, and Dr. Wolf did agree that that injury was not caused by the fall. So I'm sure the defense is going to say, what caused the injury? We can't see the laceration they are speaking about, but I'm wondering if the defense will use that to indicate some form of altercation taking place at some point. But I can see the Commonwealth arguing that the laceration maybe was caused by the glass cup that he was holding. Remember, the one with the black straw that he walked out of the waterfall with. But what I'm telling you right now is pure speculation. Let's put a pin in that because I bet you that will come up in the future. After Dr. Wolf, Christina Hanley took the stand again. She should have started off the day, but like I said, Dr. Wolf is a busy guy and he had to leave quickly. During Christina's testimony today, there was more information about the glass cup or the broken glass cup and the taillight and debris from John's clothing. I was starting to get real confused during her testimony because the evidence she reviewed was so tiny. So looking at it when they put it up there in isolation really meant nothing to me. But what really piqued my interest is when she started to say that some of the red debris found on John's clothing or in the bag where his clothing was consistent with the red plastic pieces of the taillight and also was consistent with the clear plastic of the taillight. I found that very, very interesting. So during Christina's cross, Jackson came up and guess what he was able to elicit from her? Guess what came up? Just, have a guess. Well, it was Proctor's name. Proctor's name came up on various, or I think it was maybe just one or two evidence bags. And from that point forward, Jackson called that one piece of evidence or anything related to Proctor, he called it like the Proctor evidence. And then there was this chart. And this chart has most of the items in that chart As you can see, there's going to be like green check marks and then like a red X. And these are green for what matched and red for what didn't. And there was one piece of evidence that was presented by Proctor or that was gathered by him that did match and one that did not. There was the one that did not was that one piece of glass recovered by Proctor, and that they kept referring to as evidence 7-14. Y'all, listen, I know none of that makes sense to you because I was also lost. But here's the final chart, as I said, that shows the evidence. And it shows what was a match or what fit into the puzzle piece and what did not. Here is Christina's redirect, which I think really puts everything together.
Ms. Hanley, from your conclusions that you testified about before, you found that the item 3-2, the drinking glass, was consistent with 6 different pieces from item 7-12 that were found in the roadway outside of 34 Fairview Road, correct?
That's correct.
And you also found that piece E from item 3-3, the bumper glass, was consistent with the single piece from item 7-14 that was found in the roadway outside of 34 Fairview Road. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you also found that items from 7-18.18, the debris from Mr. O'Keefe's clothing, were consistent with the item 3-1, the taillight housing, correct?
Yes, Your Honor. Sustained as to form.
Now, as far as the chalk that you were presented with on cross-examination, was there anything in there about item 7-18.18 or item 3-1, either the taillight housing or the debris from Mr. O'Keefe's clothing?
No, there was not.
Nothing further.
After that redirect, Jackson had a very brief cross. He just made it clear, and I think it's what I had been missing the entire time, that there was nothing in the bumper to match the glass cup at the scene. Honestly, after Ms. Hanley left the stand, I think it's a toss-up as to whether her evidence or the evidence that she presented was helpful for the Commonwealth or for the defense. It really does leave a lot of room for both sides to argue what they believe the glass in the bumper meant. Did it match the glass cup at the scene? No, she says it didn't, or it was too small to test, or something like that. Now, that was it for day 20. Be sure to come back tomorrow for day 21, which is slotted to be a half day. And then we are on to a 4-day long weekend. And listen, these 4 days will give you plenty of time to catch up on our Diddy trial weekly recap. That's right. Tabitha already released recap 1 for week 1, and I will be releasing recap week 2 for the Sean Combs trial. And everyone, if after listening to all 21, 22, 23 days of the Karen Read retrial and listening to the Diddy recaps, you still want more of Tabitha and I, check out our Patreon where Tabitha and I are unfiltered talking all things Karen Read and Diddy trial. And honestly, you really won't want to miss it. Check us out at patreon.com/thealternate. And if you are really feeling generous, leave us a 5-star rating wherever you're watching or listening. We are really close to 100 reviews on Apple, and that would be such a gift for our first month anniversary of daily trial coverage. Spotify viewers, you can also rate the show 5 stars, so be sure to help us out a little. Okay, I love y'all. See you on day 21, and until then, think like a juror, decide like one too.